This radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution Radio. That's at revolution.radio on the internet. I am your host, Diamond, from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project. My lovely co-host and partner, Leah Shaper, is also joining us today.
Hello.
And you're getting good at this. You're unmuted, and you didn't have to refresh.
I did have a little bit of an echo, but, you know, it's not within my control.
Today's show is going to be a fantastic one. It's going to be introductory as well as exploratory, and then become part of the theoretical realm at the end, where we are going to attempt to clarify for you the poles of Earth. If you didn't know, there are currently 3 poles that are referred to in science on Earth, and people tend to not know that. They don't know the difference between them. They get them confused, and then they throw pole shift and poles out of their left side of their mouth, and they sound really stupid because it's clear they don't know what they're talking about if you understand the difference between the geographic pole, the magnetic pole, and the geomagnetic pole. 3 different poles. And we're going to dive into that today in the first half, and then we're going to try to maybe parlay it into some deep explanation and theoretical discussion on maybe it's the magnetic field of Earth that drives the climate. And I'm talking long scale, like the Ice Age cycles, maybe even geologic time scale cycles. And it's this larger thing that we're missing, external, that's driving our magnetic dynamo, as Valentina Zarkova calls it, in the sun. We also have one in the Earth. So it's going to be a fantastic show. I'm pretty excited. Are you ready to rock and roll?
I am ready to rock and roll.
Now, be honest with the listeners. When were you ever or recently become familiar with the 3 different poles? Because there has to be a time in the past where you kind of didn't know about the difference between the rotational and the magnetic pole. Is it in college, or is it in like the last decade when we're doing this research?
Quite honestly, I don't know when exactly that knowledge was clear to me. I mean, there was probably a long period of time where I didn't even really think about it.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't. They just like repeat things. They make up their own concepts in their head, and that can become detrimental to maybe some of the ideas that they're thinking about.
Yeah, and then, you know, the general, let's say, public education narrative about poles. I mean, the basic idea that you get is, right, we've got a North Pole and a South Pole, and the magnetic North Pole is essentially almost the same as the geographic North Pole, but that's not the case.
No, and it's only been recently the case. They've only lined up in the last few years.
Yeah.
So
But
that's kind
I
of
think that's
interesting.
the general concept that most people have, is that they're the same thing, and there's no difference.
So let's dive right into it. Let me know if you can see the screen.
Yeah.
So Earth's magnetic pole is wandering, and geologists don't know why. Now, they're going to be the people you want to ask, because geologists like myself have been working with paleogeomagnetic data. We can actually determine paleomagnetism of certain rocks, specifically surface lava flows that are still in the same place they were when they flowed. So if we were to take a magnetic pole position from that volcanic rock, it's going to tell us where the geopole was at that time. So the magnetic pole at that time is going to be locked into the lava when it cools.
Yes, right. So yeah, to clarify, it's essentially the recording of what the magnetism was at that time, which is why you would call it
paleomagnetism. Type of
magnetism.
Yeah, a specific type. It's the same type when you're holding your compass and it's pointing to where you think is north. That is the magnetic pole.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And here's the weird thing. I'm going to blow your mind before we even get into the general position of the poles and what they mean. Did you know that when we hold that compass and it's pointing north, It's actually pointing to the southern magnetic pole.
No, I didn't know that.
In the bar magnet that's Earth, what is currently north for us is actually the southern pole of the magnet.
Right.
But if they ever were to tell someone that, then how much more confused would the whole world be?
Right.
So north is always up in the Arctic, south is always the Antarctic. So if the pole were to flip, it would actually go back to the position that we're actually calling it.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately,
we just labeled it differently. That's
yeah,
it.
it's really bizarre.
Right.
And the fact that
Labeled it differently to
geologists
make it
don't,
clear and obvious.
yeah, and the fact that geologists don't know why, neither do planetary scientists, astrophysicists, anyone. There's a bunch of theories on a few things. The most important is what creates the magnetic field on Earth to create these magnetic poles. You know, there's been a theory around for decades that there's an inner and outer core of solid and liquid iron that are rotating at high speeds that are creating this magnetic field, but there are issues with that. There are a couple issues. The first is the latent magnetism issue in molten material. Molten materials rise above a certain Curie point, like iron, they can't be magnetic.
Mm-hmm.
What they can be is magnetized by something nearby that's magnetic.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just not going to give us the magnetic field of the Earth that we see, which extends, if you don't know, to the sun. I mean, it's gigantic, our magnetosphere.
Yeah, and it just won't be strong enough if you've got temperatures below their Curie temperatures.
So those are the starting point issues with the whole liquid, solid, iron core idea creating magnetism. The second problem, we'll get into the second half, is that the Earth doesn't even look like that when we look at it in 3 dimensions. You know, the standard like shell model they show you in geology, it doesn't look like that based on new data. So we'll get to that at the end.
Right.
But first, let's prove to you that the magnetic pole has been rapidly moving. You know, when I was in grade school, it was assumed, and then through high school, that the magnetic pole in the north, and I was told this, is right near the rotational pole.
Right.
But they were lying to me because back here in 1980, it was thousands of miles away from the rotational pole.
Yeah.
They're liars. It was in Canada. I don't know why they didn't want to tell me that. But you can see that since 1980, the magnetic pole has been rapidly accelerating and moving now across the rotational pole position and headed towards Siberia, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can see here on the bottom here, how much of the Earth that is about half of half a hemisphere. That's a quarter of the Earth. The magnetic pole has moved in just about 100 years.
That's a very good diagram to include here. I'm sorry that our audio people can't see this.
But what you should glean from the audio is that the magnetic North Pole has moved a substantial distance relative to the size of the Earth. Almost a quarter of the size of the Earth it's moved.
Yeah, that's huge.
And all in 100 years.
Right.
So prior to that, it was just stagnating around for hundreds of years. I wonder if I have a graphic of that up. No, I don't.
And of course, just to be clear, that does not mean that the rotational axis of the Earth has moved. It's just
there's no evidence that that has really ever moved. The only evidence, and we talked about that last week and I think a prior week, is that the crust may have shifted relative to the rotational pole. The Earth has always been rotating here on the axis of rotation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is a hypothetical spot, a point you could put up near the North Pole where the Earth is spinning.
Mm-hmm.
And we really can't mark it because it's probably in the Arctic Ocean there on the surface of the water.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But in fact, Russia sent a submarine down to the depths of the Arctic Ocean and planted a flag there in 2008.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
There's North Pole and then Russia, or whatever it says. So they own the North Pole.
It belongs to us.
The rotational pole is the pole on which the Earth rotates. If that were to move, we would all die just a little bit.
Yes.
If the rotational pole moves because of angular momentum and things, there would be horrendous effects on Earth.
Frankly, it's hard to understand how that would even happen just because of the forces of angular momentum. Like, how would that axis shift? Right? Like, the forces at that point are so tight, it doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, the only way you can logically shift the rotational axis of Earth is if you hit the planet with a very large celestial body. Something like the size of the moon. If it hit us at 50,000 miles an hour, it would move the Earth.
Yeah.
So, and that's not happening very often. So
yeah, you would have to have a major disruption to the angular momentum, I think is basically what you're saying.
Yeah, so I don't think it can be magnetic in nature or some kind of a cosmic effect like a switch that moves the rotational pole of Earth.
Yeah.
It would have to be an impactor.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
So the axis of rotation is set. The Earth has been spinning this way for billions of years. But what has shifted is the crust, and it may be due to expanding Earth or plate tectonics.
Mm-hmm.
We lean towards expanding Earth, which is like modified plate tectonics.
Mm-hmm.
We just add a few more things to plate tectonics, like adding more matter to Earth over hundreds of millions of years, with rapid times of expansion and then times of quiescence.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so while this is going on, the Earth exists. It's rotating on its axis. Something in the core is generating an electric current, which creates a magnetic field. In modern science, we know that there are electric currents pouring into Earth. We call it the auroral belt. The aurora is the expression of the Birkeland current, which connects our planet to the sun. So the sun is directly charging Earth through this Birkeland current. You can call it the auroral belt. And we have high times of charge during geomagnetic storms. That's when you get the aurora that gets excited and that rushes down into the North and South Pole because of the way our magnetic field takes the energy and pours it into the Earth. Now, if you have all this energy coming into the poles at the auroral belt, where does it go?
Mm-hmm.
It goes all the way probably to the core and then wraps back out at the equator, similar to a magnet.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the auroral belt is controlled by what we call the geomagnetic pole. This is a very hypothetical pole.
Mm-hmm.
It really doesn't exist except for math. And because it has to do with the fact that the magnetic pole you can find using your compass, the magnetic pole we just showed you moved a quarter of the distance of the Earth in 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
So the magnetic pole is moving. And the only way to determine it is with a compass. Whereas the geomagnetic pole is the residual magnetism within the rocks that is left by the magnetic pole.
So it's kind of like a paleomagnetic measurement, essentially, because it's a record of the magnetism at a certain point of time that's fairly recent.
It's actually still now. Let me
it is? Oh dear.
Okay, we're back. It's actually still now. So the geomagnetic pole is determined now, but it's based on the residual magnetism of the planet, and it's determined where the aurora goes into Earth. So what happens is if the magnetic pole sits in one place, like it did in Canada for hundreds of years before it started moving, all those rocks have the latent magnetism from the pole being there. And if it rapidly moves away thousands of miles like it just did, that area of Canada is still going to be the geomagnetic pole for a while until it slowly releases the magnetism. Because the pole's gone, it's going to lose that magnetic imprint.
Yeah.
But because of the amount of magnetism, that's the most significant pole when it comes to space weather, because it literally is controlling the magnetic field of Earth. The magnetic pole is not controlling the field. It moves around and creates the field due to its residual effects on the surface. Isn't that bizarre?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Even more bizarre, the magnetic North Pole and the magnetic South Pole, they don't have to be dipolar. They're currently not on other opposite sides of Earth. They're off by many degrees. In fact, they're traveling towards each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe part of the critical piece of understanding that, right, is that the pole itself is really just like the central point, the high point of the charge of the field, right? Like the point itself isn't really that important. It's just it's the central location of the magnetic force, if that makes sense.
True. And listen what happens that we know of in antiquity. Like back 41,500 years ago, during the largest magnetic excursion, we're in an excursion now, meaning the poles are moving towards the equator. So during the Lachamp, they moved towards the equator, kind of like they're doing now. And right before 0 point, when they were like 20 degrees off the equator on both sides, geomagnetic poles started popping up all over.
Right.
Could have been 4 or 5 of them. Some of them were at the equator. So the magnetism of the whole Earth gets very squirrely as the magnetic poles weaken and reach the equator. Geomagnetic poles pop up everywhere because of the weakened magnetic field. And that wreaks havoc on weather and animals and all kind of things we could think about on Earth.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the difference between considering like a magnetic pole, a central point where the strength is very concentrated versus where it becomes very dispersed, right? So then you get these various areas of higher charge, but none of them are nearly as strong as they would be if the pole was very concentrated.
Yeah,
I don't know
so
if I
once
really
it
put that right,
weakens,
but
like I guess old geomagnetic poles could take over, areas that were very magnetic millions of years ago, but are weak. But if the field gets weak enough, they are now the strongest magnetic pole.
yeah.
Yeah, very interesting.
I mean, you can see this when you look at like mapping of the magnetic field on Earth, right? You get these areas where it's clear that there's like a lot of dispersed charge, so to speak, when the field is weak, versus something that's concentrated and highly charged. That's not really the right word, but
Yeah, and this is where a lot of the fear mongering comes out from some people that claim if the magnetic poles reach a 40-degree mark, that they'll flip. And that all comes from observational magnetic experiment, where if you move one magnet close enough to another one, it spins around and goes snap and snaps.
Right.
Yeah. But that is not the way the Earth works. And there's no paleomagnetic evidence for that. There is evidence that if the field weakens enough, numerous geomagnetic poles pop up because of the weak nature of the overall field and the fact that there's residual magnetism in the rocks on Earth.
Right. So instead of having a strong dipole, you have a very weak one.
Or a bunch of them
that
pop up.
Right, a bunch of really weak dipoles, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the poles. We've got the axis of rotation. We've got the magnetic pole, which is where your compass points, and we've got the geomagnetic pole, which is where the aurora enters Earth. That's it. Those are the 3 poles. Now, which pole is moving?
Magnetic.
The magnetic pole, right? Because we are in a magnetic excursion. That means the magnetic pole is taking an excursion, and a rapid one, which could spell bad things for Earth. What it allows is more space energy to come in. This is in the form of geomagnetic storms and aurora, cosmic rays as well. And we've discussed how cosmic rays can heat the subsurface and cause more volcanic activity. Amazingly enough, a paper just came out showing that cosmic rays are directly correlated to seismicity.
Nice.
Large-scale earthquakes occur during solar minimums.
Right. Which we know. We've known that for quite some time, I think. It's just nice to see when somebody does the work and really shows that.
Yeah, people have been postulating this for a while. There are books on it, and now it's being confirmed in peer-reviewed literature. So we're in a magnetic excursion. The magnetic pole is moving, which means there's increased energy at our geomagnetic pole. It's my idea, and I think you agree with me, that if you put more energy at the geomagnetic pole, which means more aurora or more energy going into the core, that the Earth could A, possibly expand, or B, possibly heat from the inside out.
Well, and you could argue that that's kind of all of the same thing, right? There is a continuum between energy and mass. They're not different from each other, and heat is a part of that process because it's energy. So you could argue that there's perhaps some mechanism for energy entering through the geomagnetic poles that at the core is creating mass in some way, which then also gets subsequently released through heat and pushes mass and energy. I mean, this is we're going to talk about this, I think, in the second half of the show here.
Yeah, tell me more. That's sexy. Tell me more about your thermodynamics. So something, the most obvious thing that people comment is thermal expansion. So if you heat something enough, it'll expand. It's in fact how seas rise. They don't rise from fresh water running in. They rise from thermal expansion and heat. So catastrophic sea level rise is really a fallacy.
Right. But also thermal expansion is a bit different than what I was just talking about, right? Because when we talk about thermal expansion, we typically mean that like literally the space between atoms is increasing.
Right.
Which induces a density change, which is not necessarily what's happening here.
Right. And because of the amount of expansion we need in 200 million years since the beginning of the Atlantic Ocean, let's say, thermal expansion cannot explain that. We would literally need like 4 or 5 masses of Earth to fill that void.
Right. Otherwise, Earth would be like a weird, loose, non-dense sponge or something.
Yeah, it would be hollow. And I think we did a show on hollow Earth.
We did. We talked about it as well in relation to expanding Earth theory. So if anybody's interested in that, you should go back a couple of months, I think. And I think we did 2 episodes on all of that.
Yeah. So real quick, we can explain the change in the magnetic pole. We now know in the last 10 years that these shifts, so you could see here where the magnetic pole, the North Pole, sat for hundreds of years, magnetizing these rocks, which is why the geopole is still here. It literally from 1590 to 1900 stayed right here in Canada. And then right after the Carrington event in 1860, there was a geomagnetic jerk, which is this blue dot, I think. And then it changed direction. There's also a geomagnetic jerk in 1730. And you see how it changed direction there?
Yeah.
There's a geomagnetic jerk in 1632, which changed that direction. And so we've confirmed that these changes in direction occur during geomagnetic jerks.
And the jerk aspect is very apparent from this diagram, right? Because you see periods of slow, gradual change. Some periods are short, some of them are long, but then you see this abrupt shift in direction. So it's not a constant process.
No, but the one thing we've recently seen in the last 1,000 years is rapid acceleration. That's never happened in the recent past. And rapid acceleration, you could see what I mean by rapid, 1830 to 1940, right? That's 110 years. 1940 to 2040, we would be at the equator.
It's almost 120 years, but yeah.
And so you can see just here is 20 years.
That's crazy.
20 years here is more distance than 100 years here.
Yeah.
So it is rapidly accelerating. And this leads us all to believe that we are in the next geomagnetic excursion, which will only be stopped or shifted during the next geomagnetic jerk. All right, so I hope we cleared everything up in the first half here about the North Magnetic Pole. It's actually the South Pole on the bar magnet, but we call it North because we have to. And
otherwise people would be very confused.
The geomagnetic pole is a hypothetical place that we can determine based on where the aurora goes in. And it's actually where the magnetosphere has the northern entrance of its power system. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the top of the magnetosphere is the geomagnetic pole. And then that brings us to the paper we're going to get into in the second half here, climate change alternative. We ignore to our peril. And we're going to be talking about exothermic core theory. And it's going to go against the paradigm, there it is, of this standard paradigm of Earth that we all learn in Geo 50, where there's an inner core and an outer core and a mantle, an asthenosphere, and then the crust. This oversimplified model gets blown out of the water with recent 3-dimensional models of the Earth that shows that there are, in fact, huge 3-dimensional protrusions on the outer core. And what these could be may very well be driving the climate change on the surface. If you look at one of these prominences, this one here coming up, boom, right there.
Yeah.
And another one, these are approaching the surface. The largest one is where the East African Rift Zone is. That is where two plates are pulling apart and a new ocean will be soon. The other one is directly over the spot in the Pacific that we say is burning up and is causing El Nino. So tantalizing, we're going to come back and explain maybe why the ocean is catastrophically heating.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine.
There was blood on the wire.
Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance. People under fire. Children at the cannons.
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio!
Join me on the Brian Rouge Show on Revolution Radio, Eastern Standard Time, every Tuesday night from 6 to 8. We talk about the four most vital things, in my view, affecting all of humanity. Number one is UFOs and aliens and their agenda for the advancement of humanity. Number two is the Jewish establishment's control over all aspects of human civilization. Number three, the truth about Adolf Hitler, how he was the opposite of what we've been told. Number four is advanced ancient global civilizations. Join me on the Brian Rouge Show, Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 on Studio B on Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at buyer risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
And we're back for the second half of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution. The #1 listener-supported internet radio. So go out there, become a Patreon, give them $1 a month. Their support, we're support free speech is what I'm trying to say. We're losing that option all across the board here. So Revolution Radio is probably going to be one of the most listened to radio channels in maybe a few years.
Yeah, and they're doing a great service. I mean, we may not like all of the theses of the bumpers, but it is free speech. So
yeah, so you got to pick what you want to listen to. So we're on the topic of climate change. We could have talked about the catastrophic pole shift. We did that last week. I think we covered that pretty much as well enough as we have to. But we did conclude that we're in a magnetic excursion. It's pretty obvious based on the activity of the magnetic pole. The North Pole has been rapidly moving and accelerating, which has happened in times past during these geomagnetic excursions. They happen between 6 and 10,000 year time intervals. The last few excursions, we had a triple dip excursion during the Younger Dryas event, one around 12.8, one around 11.5, one around 8,000. We've had other, and there's lots of them. They happen pretty regularly, but they're not all the same strength. They vary widely. The most vigorous magnetic excursion in the last 100,000 years is the Lechamp excursion 41,500 years ago, which was a mass extinction event. There's no impactors. We didn't see any comets. The temperature didn't get really crazy, but lots of people died. Lots of fauna died. The Neanderthals died off, and we became king, Homo sapiens sapien. And a lot of the megafauna died off too, and new megafauna took their place. So interesting times. We do know that there's a huge spike in UVB. There is a destruction of ozone during this time. So it could be very harsh environment, albeit not a big temperature shift or anything. The environment itself could be very detrimental to life. There could be cancers happening and could be very caustic, let's say, to be out in the sun.
Yeah, I mean, if you're having that excursion, I mean, it would seem that it just creates almost like a domino effect of other variables that have to adjust. And of course, as you importantly raise, when that happens, Earth's magnetic field gets very weak, right? So we're extremely subject to cosmic rays from outside the Earth. So then you've got increases in UVB, and obviously that can cause genetic mutation and et cetera.
Right, and we've already talked about the work of Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould on punctuated equilibria and how that concept lines right up with the work of Robert Felix. What is the title of his book? Evolutionary.
I think it's Evolutionary Changes in Magnetic Excursions, something like that.
Something, Cosmic Leaps.
Evolutionary Leaps.
And everyone else knows but us.
Yeah.
Rest in peace, Robert Felix. We had him at LeCon. He sold all of his books he brought. So God bless his soul and the work that he has done. So we're going to jump right in and share the screen and get onto the topic of climate change. Because everyone's heads are blowing up here because of the northern Atlantic sea surface temperature here. This graph, everyone, all the alarmists on the tweet box have been showing this graph. I'm sure you've seen it.
Yeah.
And it shows this catastrophic temperature rise. But any discerning graph looker at her will come over here and can see that this amount of change right here is very small, 0.2 degrees C. So a fifth of a degree C isn't really what I would call a catastrophe. Would you?
No. I have a question for you because
Go ahead.
This writing that we're going to look at references 2020 being the hottest El Nino on record. Is that true? Is there a line for 2020 in here?
There's a line for the 2015 Super El Nino.
Yeah.
There is a line for the 2016 Super El Nino. Here's 2020, right there, this green peak.
Okay.
But it still doesn't compare to this 2023 peak.
No, not at all. No.
But what we can see is that there has been a rapid shift in the type of heating that's happening. You're looking at the North Atlantic sea surface anomaly. And people have just looked into it, started to realize that if you look at 2021, 2020, 2022, and even 2023 here, when you get shifts in temperature like this rapid in the sea surface temperature, it really can't be explained through the climate or weather.
No, and
That's the
important-
problem.
Yes. And it's also important to look here too at the time of year that these rises are happening, right? Because obviously in the northern hemisphere, if it's spring and summer, you can expect warmer temperatures. But if we start seeing spikes at a different time of year, let's say in the fall and winter, there's something else going on.
Yeah, and let's get the paper up before I get into that. We really didn't cover ultra low velocity zones either and disprove that shape of the Earth. But I'll leave you links to all of the recent interactive studies on what the actual Earth looks like inside. And as you can see here from these images, it's not that nice concentric ring thing that we were taught in college.
Actually, I have another question before we move on here. What are these models based on?
If you all the seismic data that travels through the Earth, you can determine based on the speed of the waves. So they're using all this data now that because we have supercomputers, you can take all the data and actually get three-dimensional imaging. It's similar to
it's like doing an ultrasound.
Yeah, well, the way geologists do it is they create an earthquake. They put monitors all over a field. Let's say if I want a small gravity map, monitors all over the field. Then I have this giant truck that shoots a hammer into the ground. Oh! It shakes the earth, and based on the speed of the P and the S waves and all the monitors, they triangulate and they can make a 3D model underground. And that's how you can find buried structures or hidden holes and tombs and things like that.
Right.
Yeah, so all these links will be below on the ultra low velocity zone and the studies that they've done and what they mean. But we're going to finish this up on this interesting paper. If I can even find it. So let's find the paper. There it is. And we're going to discuss some of the topics in here. Now, climate change is currently explained as man-made fossil fuel production, and CO2 is what controls the climate. But any discerning scientist that does a cursory review will find that there is not a single peer-reviewed paper in the literature proving that CO2 controls the climate, not nary a one. And so therein lies the issue. So for 30 years, the whole world's been playing along with a narrative that is not based on science.
Well, and I mentioned this last week, but the very simple debunking of that is if you look at graphs of temperature and CO2, and you see that temperature leads CO2, not the other way around. And the author of this writing, Ethical Skeptic, points this out readily in this paper. That's just one piece of it, but that's a really important thing to realize.
And almost all the paleoclimatologists that have pointed out the CO2 lag, they're the ones that are called climate deniers. Those are the ones that were defunded. Those are the Tony Hellers and the people that get sued by Michael Mann. But those are the true heroes because they're the true scientists. Now, what if the geologic model that we're fed is wrong? This one. And there's something else going on in the core that's creating massive plumes, which we can now image. What if that's what's going on? And that brings us to the exothermic model. If this line here, if the white area is the inner and outer core that we don't know what it is, in the paper, they use the solid nickel iron idea.
But also importantly, that this is in like a crystalline lattice that shifts from one core to the other.
Yes.
Yeah.
The heat budget, you mean?
Well, there's a distinction made between. I don't understand all of this very well, but distinction made between. Why don't you continue talking and I'll find the terminology?
Well, my idea is simply by looking at this graphic, you can see that there are multiple things going on. There's small scale thermodynamic cycles happening right at the surface. Like there's larger scale plumes moving up at a different periodicity. The whole system is moving around at a different periodicity. And so my idea using this paper is that what if whatever's controlling the magnetic field of Earth, also controlling the sun, is what is controlling the amount of energy or material that's being produced here at the core. It's all related.
Yes.
So as the magnetic field weakens, whatever's happening at the core increases because you have
Yes.
more energy pouring in.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, it's a great concept because it really shows the interplay of the Earth dynamics with the sun dynamics. And it shows how you have this constant cycle that shifts. So there's not you don't need to identify like a specific trigger. You can look through the whole process and see how the sun influences the Earth dynamics, and then the Earth dynamics are subsequently affected by the sun.
Yeah, and more importantly, just in this graph alone, we should talk about this because it basically disproves climate change in an instant.
Mhm.
We've got these rapid shift. So you're looking at the CO2 parts per million from Mauna Loa, which is the standard used worldwide, and you can clearly see that the Earth breathes.
Mm-hmm.
And the bottom of the CO2 happens sometime in September. And then it begins rising through the winter all the way to the next summer. If the temperature controlled CO2, this is not how the graph would look.
Mm-hmm.
Because the coldest temperature is right here, January, February.
Yep.
And the CO2 is already rising.
Mm-hmm. Well,
It's
also
the
you have a
exact opposite of what's-
CO2 rise from October to May, but that is over the course of the winter, and obviously in the northern hemisphere, obviously, and you're not seeing a temperature increase then.
Yeah, so what happens is the temperature increases through August here, and it takes several months, September, 2 months for the CO2 to catch up.
Mhm.
There's a 2-month lag between the temperature and CO2 on the Mauna Loa graph. The temperature leads CO2 in this graph.
Mhm.
Now, what's more interesting is see how they have the stair steps put on here?
Yeah.
And they're corresponding this jump right here to look at this jump.
Mhm.
So you get a jump, you get these vertical jumps in CO2 after the temperature jumps.
Mm-hmm.
So it's lagging. It's doing all the things we just said.
Yeah.
The CO2 is not driving temperature. The temperature is driving the CO2. But what is driving this rapid sea surface temperature change? That is the question. And what's interesting about this paper is a couple of things that I had highlighted but are now not highlighted. we know that oceans heat the atmosphere. And in fact, like the reason the climate is in certain cities in the West Coast is because the Pacific is warm.
Mm-hmm.
So it never gets cold there because there's always warm air blowing over the Pacific, which then blows over the land.
Mm-hmm.
Very hard to get cold next to an ocean that's warm.
Mm-hmm.
So these oceans heat. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and by the way, you can easily prove this if you just think about like the thermal mass of water, right? You know, we have greenhouses where we keep large volumes of water to keep the temperature up. It works quite well.
Yeah, it doesn't ever get below freezing if you have enough water.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. And there's another interesting thing that has been exposed recently. People are trying to understand why Antarctica is melting. And then about 5 years ago, they figured out it's melting from below.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then they did a survey and they found 90 new, or some ridiculous number of new erupting volcanoes underneath that ice sheet, which they allude to here. It says, oh no, is it even there? Yeah. It says abyssal ocean currents are also heating up. And they speed up from the discrete addition of kinetic energy. And then they say here, look, Arctic and Antarctic polar ice sheets melt from the bottom up.
Yep. That is certainly not human carbon emissions coming from underneath Antarctica.
Melting from the bottom up.
Right.
Yeah, and there's another graph that disproves global warming.
Mm-hmm.
So their idea in this paper is that there's some heat that is coming from deep in the ocean that no one is really talking about.
You know, something else, you just passed by a graph. Ethical Skeptic points out pretty. No, I'm looking for where it is exactly. Well, generally just points out that temperature increases at the moment are like linear, but CO2 increases are
Let's hear it.
exponential. I was thinking of a different graph, but yeah. So that alone suggests that there's some other factor going on here in any warming that we do see.
Do you see the graph anywhere?
I've lost right here, this one. I mean, the way that he explains this also is when you do some regressions on this data, I mean, you can see the difference in the relationship, but you can basically see it here. I mean, you've got one line that's a accelerated rise and one that's linear.
Yeah, and clearly, as of 2010, the separation is getting more pronounced.
Right. So if
Not
this is
only
all,
that, there's
if
been a
this is all due
standstill
to-
here in temperature has been completely flat for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So this graph would actually, yeah, it's actually flattening out, and that's the interesting nature of this. Now, a lot of this can be explained by this residual heat that's coming from deep in the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And they have the tomography map right here.
Yeah. Yep.
And I wish I knew where that graph was. This paper is quite voluminous.
It is voluminous and extensive, and it really deserves a very thorough read.
Yeah, and I wish I could find that because I was actually looking at it last night. So, but here's a good picture, and this would be the idea. So the idea is if this heat source at the outer core is literally able to bubble up to the surface through these plumes, which we can now image, it's going to be affecting the crust at the bottom of the ocean right below that spot. And if there is periods of intense heat, what you're going to get is you're going to get increased heat here on the bottom, which is going to be added to the circulation. There'll be a lag time, but then it will eventually reach the surface. Now, they did some cursory explanation on what happens here in the spring. Can you speak to that as far as the warming and the CO2?
Well, I mean, some of this obviously is going to be the effect from the sun because it's spring in the northern hemisphere. We get more sunlight. However, it doesn't seem to all be explained by the sun. There's additional heating that needs to be explained.
Yeah, so that brings me to the final thoughts here. We don't have much time, and I can't believe we didn't get to it. So this is the ENSO cycle.
Yeah.
On the top.
Yeah.
It ebbs and flows every few years. This is from 1910 to 2010. And what we've seen is rapid rises in temperatures for El Nino off of the coast of South America right here. They really can't be explained by any other mechanism except for maybe heating of the ocean at depth, because there is just not enough thermodynamics in the weather to increase the sea surface temperature this rapidly,
right?
Especially in the North Atlantic.
Yeah.
These numbers are North Atlantic numbers.
Right.
Yeah. So what is doing it? Well, one of those plumes, like I said, that are coming up from the deep mantle, one of those ultra low velocity zones is right underneath of what triggers El Nino. This area of the ocean that heats unexplainably very rapidly during these events. And so this simply could be a cycle of heating from that plume that comes up and affects the area, depending on the size of the plume, 1 to 3 years, and then it goes away.
Right.
It's that simple.
Right.
Now, I want you to look at this ENSO cycle and see how it's kind of regular, but it goes more like up and down in larger patterns. And look at the insulation of Earth over the last 800,000 years. It looks very similar. It looks like it's just scaled differently.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing is the same cycle at a different scale.
Right.
Whatever's driving this insulation in watts per square meter is what's powering the sun. The sun thereby is powering the Earth through the geomagnetic pole, the auroral
Yeah.
belt, and that
Yes.
Birkeland current. And when the sun shuts down, more energy comes to the earth, there's more heating at the core, and we have global warming.
Yes. Well, and then there's
But
Go ahead.
then it shuts down. Every time we have this massive global warming, it ends in a very bad way, each and every time.
Yes. Well, and the other factor in
Warming,
this that
ice age. Look,
that's
it's trying to get warm here and said, no, it's going to be cold for 70,000 more years.
right, right. Well, and then there's another, I mean, this probably we could talk about this for probably a whole show, but there's another element in here that Ethical Skeptic points out, which is that, okay, so we've got energy in the form of heat and to some degree mass coming from inside towards the outer portion of Earth, right? Which literally will slow Earth. If there's more mass going towards the outer surfaces of Earth, it's like the perfect analogy is given in this paper where you talk about an ice skater who puts their arms out to slow down their spin, right? So the more mass you have at the edges, you're going to slow down. And so what's really interesting is that when the rotation of Earth slows down, temperatures on Earth are going up and vice versa. When the spin is increasing, it gets colder on Earth. So it's like there's a process going on here, and at some point we reach a threshold where all of this flips. So this can help explain perhaps these dramatic shift in temperatures that we see on the geological timescale.
The tipping point. And guess what the Earth has recently done?
Go ahead.
It's speeding up its rotation.
Yes,
we just
and that's also
had
brought
the fastest day ever last year.
We had a long period of the rotation slowing, and now it's speeding up, and it does seem to coincide with global average temperatures starting to drop.
Yeah, so that means that the interstadial is over.
Yeah.
Here's the Eemian. This is the warmest time on Earth during the Ice Age, much warmer than it is today, even warmer than the predicted global warming psychopathic numbers for 2050. It's still warmer during the Eemian, which is during the Ice Age, just so we make that clear.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
And we're just over here. So it's actually like 4 degrees C warmer during the last glacial cycle. And we're still in an ice age. And they claim that we're in the Anthropocene and the ice age is over.
Yeah.
There's literally zero evidence for that. It's only a talking point, and it really reveals how embarrassing science is.
The state of science is a wreck.
Now, the Earth is speeding up. The day is getting shorter. And based on this paper, it means it's supposed to get colder. And based on all of the study that I've done as a stratigrapher, there's 2 parts of a cycle. There's a warm part and a cold part. Every 26,000 years, there's a high sea level period and a low sea level period. And we are at the high end of the high sea level period.
Mm-hmm.
And so all the proxies are pointing towards us entering the next glacial cycle, which is the least of our worries because that takes thousands of years to fully dive into that. Yeah. But if we were at the cusp of increasing magnetic excursion, we could see some of the effects that occurred perhaps during the Lachamp magnetic excursion. And that's kind of scary.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Yeah, the most obvious effects will be what we talked about in the beginning: increased volcanoes, increased seismicity. Now, what we mean by increased volcanoes is that we only have VEI 6 and 7 eruptions during these weak magnetic field times.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're in that one right now. The next cycle is supposed to be the weakest in maybe 300 years.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
By the way, Ethical Skeptic does reference, increased seismicity and volcanic activity, but it's funny because he talks about having a hard time getting unbiased data from this. And then I guess at some point he eventually gets this data set from the Smithsonian. And apparently I don't know if it was like they threatened him or whatever, but they did not want him to use this data for what he is saying here.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, we know the Smithsonian's have all the giants and all the Egyptians from the Grand Canyon.
Yeah. By the way, I also just want to do a quick little shout out to Ethical Skeptic, because this paper that is available online at theethicalskeptic.com. I mean, it's pretty deep. There's a lot of information in here and a lot of pieces that are being put together pretty well. And if this is hard to digest, he also has a Twitter handle, which is, I think, just Ethical Skeptic. And a lot of this information is presented more piecemeal on Twitter, so maybe a little bit more digestible.
And I don't know
what timing
Ethical Skeptic's pronouns are.
I don't know that either. Yeah.
That's a boom. All right. Thanks for watching. Hope you got something out of the podcast. Join us next week when we'll talk about something else amazing.
Bye.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.